Welcome back to Beyond the Uniform. I'm Justin Asiri, and each week I try to give tools and helpful tips to people on active duty and recently transitioned veterans to help them navigate their civilian career. Normally, I do that by interviewing veterans, learning about what they do in their civilian career, what they like about it, what they dislike about it, what it's like on a day-to-day basis, and advice for any other veteran who wants to follow in their footsteps. Today, for episode 176, this is a part 2 to episode number 175. So if you have not listened to episode number 175, stop what you're doing, check that out. In that episode, we talked about storytelling. We talked about tips and 3 different examples of veterans talking about their elevator pitch, about the way that they told their story in interviews and in networking. So check out episode number 175. I'm going to continue with that right now. But first, if you are enjoying Beyond the Uniform, there are 3 things. Any one of these 3 things would mean the world to me if you're able to do. The first is the donate button at beyondtheuniform.io. Contributions help keep the show going. All of these resources are 100% free. Donations help keep it that way. Second, I'm just starting to get together a sponsorship program. So if you know of a company that would love to pay to advertise on the show, either to hire vets or because they're offering a product or service that vets would find compelling, definitely send them my way. And 3, if you could definitely spread the word to your friends. If you know people on active duty, if you're still on active duty, help me get the word out, get this in front of more veterans and active duty members who could benefit from the show. Okay, so let's dive in. We're going to be talking about interviewing, about storytelling, and just kind of a couple concrete examples. And this is just going to be 3 or 4 different anecdotes from my own life. If you want it from other people, check out episode number 175. So first of all, let me share with you an approach to interviewing that for me made things a lot simpler. And that is, if you go to any Google search and do common interview questions, you're going to get 100 different questions. And that can be a little bit overwhelming, especially when in the last episode everyone's talking about the importance of practicing. Well, there's an approach you can do, which I think simplifies things, which is to really think and craft through 3 to 5 really tight, compelling stories that show. Stories are great because they show instead of telling. They show what you're capable of. So what I would do is literally have 5 stories, and I'll give you 5 different examples from my own life, and you can map these stories to anything. So I went through in the reprogramming seminar, I had a visual for this, but it's like, if they say, tell me about a time when you failed, well, I've got a story for that. If they and that same story about failure is also, if they ask, tell me about a time when you learned from a mistake. It's literally taking 75 interview questions and having 5 stories that you can just slot in. So an interview then becomes, I have really practiced and nailed these 5 stories, so let me give you the best story for your question. So let's get concrete. Here's some examples. Consulting interviews. That's what I did when I was at Stanford Business School. So let me take you through a story, and then I'm going to tell you why I tell it in this way. And the story is, for those of you who are on active duty, I was on submarines. There's this thing called the Green Book, which is anytime something broke, it needed to be logged in the Green Book so the auxiliary division could go and fix it. And that wasn't happening. And I was in charge of the auxiliary division. I was the damage control assistant. And so I set out to fix that. That was a little random task I was given. So that's the backstory for those of you on active duty. But if I was telling that in a civilian setting, I'm just going to give you the quick 30-second version, but I would say something to the effect of, I was on a submarine and maintenance is vital to keep the 180 crew members alive. I was the division officer leading a team of 20 responsible for fixing all the equipment on the ship. And what we found was that problems weren't being identified and corrected quickly, which is a big, big deal on submarines. So what I did is I met with the crew and I interviewed different stakeholders to figure out the source of the problem. And what I found was in these interviews that the tracking system we were using was broken. So using feedback from the crew and figuring out the best practices, I fixed it. I then met with the crew over the course of several weeks and I sold it to them. I really told them about how great this was and how important it was. And I incorporated the people who gave me the feedback so they championed it. And it was implemented and it led to reducing our average time to identify and correct deficiencies by 25%. Curtain, I take a bow, I get the job offer. But here's why I did this. So what I did, let's work backwards. I said, okay, what do consultants do? Consultants, if you haven't listened to all my interviews on consulting, definitely check that out. But consultants basically are hired by a company to come in. They identify a problem. They interview key stakeholders at the company. They do a lot of analysis. They look at a lot of data. They develop a solution. And then they have to go sell that to the client who hired them. So that's why I told the story in that way, because I knew that's what consultants do. Just like Katie Horgan in the last episode talked about, she's putting it in terms they understand. She's doing the heavy lifting for the hiring manager. I'm telling them my crazy submarine background in a sense that connects with them. And I shit you not, the person who was interviewing me said, oh, that's really great because as consultants, that's what we do. We go in. And I'm like, no fucking shit. That's why I told the story in that way. Apologies for the language, but I'm very passionate about this. So that's one point. Tell the story in a way that connects with the audience. Do the lifting for them. Interpret your background for them. Don't expect them to do that for you. Second of all, numbers are the universal language. They may not understand what damage control assistant is. They may not understand what vital maintenance is. But I tell you, they understand that I led a team of 20, and they understand that I had a 20% reduction in discrepancies. Numbers are the universal language. On your resume, in your interviews, you have to have numbers. I'm going to give you a couple quick examples. And you'll see how I've really keyed out numbers on this. Now, what I'll do for each of these, because I'm going to run through them pretty rapidly, is I'm going to give you the quick aside on what I'm really talking about, and then I'm going to give you my civilian translation of how I would explain that to someone. So, next one. So I was on submarines. I was a lieutenant. I was officer of the deck. Those of you in the Navy, I was not in the Navy. I was the qualified captain's representative in charge of the ship. So the captain's asleep, I'm off the deck, on watch, responsible for the ship. This is how I would explain it. I was the senior supervisor on a ship responsible for safe operation and navigation of a $1.3 billion nuclear-powered warship and the welfare of over 170 lives on board in clandestine operations of vital importance to national security. It's a bit of a mouthful, not that I'd be throwing that on an interview, but the point there is translating it, and there's numbers, 1.3 billion, well, that seems pretty impressive. 170 lives, that's pretty impressive. It's just one of many possible ways to speak to being officer of the deck. Next example, our ship was in shipyard. We were doing a refueling. This is just before I got out of the Navy. The engineering officer went on leave for 2 weeks. I kind of championed as assistant engineer to fill in for him while he was gone. And this is how I told that story, the succinct version. So I would say that I directed 200 military and 400 civilian workers as the captain's primary representative during a $500 million engineering overhaul. This is a position normally reserved for officers 3 years more senior to me. I think you get the point. I'm leading 600 people. It's not just military, it's also civilian. There's some obvious advantages there. $500 million engineering overhaul, that's pretty meaty. And I'm pointing out, look, normally I wouldn't be able to do that for another 3 years. So I'm explaining to them my credibility. I'm explaining to them my accomplishments. Another example. So while we were doing patrol in San Diego, we did a month-long ROTC day trips out of San Diego. So a bunch of ROTC kids thinking about submarines. Every day we'd get a new crew of them, maybe 30 of them. We took them out for a night and then brought them back and swapped them out for more college students. So the way I told that was that I created and implemented a training program for over 400 prospective submarine officers. It was assessed as, quote, the best program in the last 5 years, unquote, by Commander of West Coast Operations based on efficiency of program and feedback of participants. Again, you don't need to know anything about the military or submarines to understand leading a 400-person organization and being recognized as the best program in 5 years. That's a big deal. I'm giving credibility. Now, again, a lot of times you're going to have to do some digging to get these numbers. A lot of times you're going to have to go to your commanding officer, someone more senior, and say like, hey, about how much does that refueling cost? Oh, $500 million? Great. So you're going to have to do a lot of the heavy lifting, but it's worth it. Let me see. I got one more. So in the engine room of a submarine, the senior person is called an engineering officer of the watch. And every year you have what's called an ORS, or Operational Reactor Safety Exam. Big deal where you come out and you're drilled and they make sure that you're still legally allowed to operate the nuclear reactor of a submarine. So in that testing, I was recognized as the number one person in our group during the drills. So what I said was that I was recognized by the Department of Energy Evaluation Team as the top nuclear reactor plant supervisor out of 9, cited for command presence, initiative, and team leadership abilities. The biggest point on this is out of 9. Any of you that have an accomplishment, whether it's in your fit rep or anything, you want to put it in context that you were one out of how many. It makes a big difference. They want to know that you are excelling, because excellence in one area often leads to excellence in another. So like I said, if let's just go back and some common questions. Well, let me just take the example of I didn't give some of these examples, but like one of the stories I had is there was like a very minor laundry fire, and I ran towards, and I didn't have the breathing equipment. I was the first person there, but I didn't have the breathing equipment. So that was, and I got bitched out by our XO. That was my story on standby for telling about a time when I failed, telling about a time when I made a mistake, telling about a time when I lost face, things like that. Another story I had is when I was engineering officer of the watch, I had a conflict with my senior enlisted, my chief petty officer. So that would be my story for, quote, tell me about a time when you managed a conflict, or, quote, tell me about a time when you dealt with a difficult customer. It's just, I hope this is a helpful framework for you, but it's a way to take literally hundreds of interview questions and just simplify your life. Have 5 really good, really versatile stories. The amount of confidence it gave me was extreme, because I was able to go into an interview and have this smug feeling of like, whatever you throw at me, I'm going to have a story for you. And if you listen to episode number 175, that's what Brooke is talking about when she talks about she's basically feeding them along. She's getting them to ask the next question where she's going to succeed. Let me know if this interview format is helpful. Like I said, if you're listening to this in real time, right now I'm at a meditation retreat, but I already have 2 more interviews coming up. One about cryptocurrency, another about entrepreneurship, but I think you'll really enjoy those. But let me know if these sorts of interviews are helpful, and I'll do more of them. Have a great week, and I'll be back next week.